This chart visualizes a foundational macroeconomic reality. A massive wealth gap exists globally. Look at the extremes. An advanced nation baseline like the United States sits over $56,000 per capita, contrasted sharply against a developing nation like Bangladesh at just over $3,000. For virtually all developing nations, narrowing this specific distance is the single most important objective of their economic policy. Which brings us to the core question. Over the last half-century, why did some countries successfully close this gap, while others remain static? This wealth gap is the ultimate scoreboard. It determines whether an international trade policy succeeds or fails. For about 30 years following World War II, the dominant strategy for developing nations was a policy known as Import Substituting Industrialization, or ISI. The logic was specific. To develop a wealthy economy, a nation needs a manufacturing sector. And to build that manufacturing sector, domestic producers must be shielded from international competition. This approach relied on the infant industry argument. New manufacturing industries in developing countries require a temporary wall of tariffs to survive against foreign giants. Proponents justified this with two market failures. First, imperfect capital markets. Without sophisticated banks to fund low-profit startups, governments must step in. Second, appropriability. If property rights are weak, competitors simply copy pioneering methods and free ride. Shielding the market forces the initial risk. These arguments were persuasive enough to dictate the trade policies of large swaths of Latin America and South Asia for decades. But while the infant industry argument makes logical sense on paper, the macroeconomic data eventually showed it did not deliver actual economic development in reality. The structural flaw in the strategy was simple. Putting up a wall removes international competition, but it does not automatically generate efficiency, skilled labor, or reliable infrastructure. This table shows effective protection rates, measuring how aggressively governments distorted market incentives to shelter domestic firms. Look at the extremes. Through overlapping quotas and domestic content rules, nations like Chile and Pakistan protected their manufacturing at rates of 182 and 271%. This level of shelter created pseudo-infant industries, domestic manufacturing sectors that survived solely because of trade barriers, rather than genuine structural strength. Relying on a small domestic market meant local firms fought for limited monopoly profits, causing inefficient small-scale production. As a result, production costs in these protected industries regularly reached 3 or 4 times the global average price. The ultimate macroeconomic result was widespread economic stagnation, rather than the promised catch-up growth. By 1980, India was actually relatively poor compared to the United States than it had been at its independence in 1950. Instead of breeding globally competitive powerhouses, the protective walls of import substitution created inefficient monopolies that actively slowed national growth. By the mid-1980s, an intellectual shift took hold as developing nations realized the strategy was failing and began dismantling their trade barriers. This chart tracks the dramatic fall of developing country tariff rates from their peak in the early 80s down to roughly 10%. Notice the steep policy pivots made by India and Brazil, countries that once relied heavily on protectionist strategy. This graph plots the corresponding macroeconomic reaction. As tariffs fell, developing nation trade volume as a percentage of GDP tripled. We see a micro-case study of this shift in Lithuania and join the World Trade Organization. This data maps the results of that export-led strategy, with Lithuania's exports jumping from 53 to 76% of GDP between 1995 and 2015. This was followed by a rise in per capita income, climbing from roughly $2,000 to over $14,000 in just 20 years. For small nations, this pivot is a geographic necessity. They cannot rely on import substitution because their domestic consumer bases are too small to support efficient industry. The data from 1985 onward suggests that integrating into the global market was a primary catalyst for rapid wealth creation. The most distinct evidence of export-oriented growth emerged from a period of rapid economic catch-up, known as the Asian takeoff. This chart maps the convergence of Asian economies toward advanced country income levels over the last 50 years. When we overlay export data directly onto these GDP timelines, the mechanism for this growth becomes clear. GDP accelerates exactly as export volume rises. This is most visible in China's pivot in 1978, moving from a centrally planned, isolated economy to a global market participant. This policy integration enabled China to move from an isolated state to its current status as a dominant force in advanced global manufacturing. In India, the story was similar. For decades, bureaucratic restrictions suppressed the economic potential of a massive population. Operating under extreme import substitution policies and a restrictive license Raj, India maintained a sluggish baseline growth rate, with trade volumes at a mere 5% of GDP. Contrast that stagnation with modern India, which has become an integrated global force in information technology. Once trade liberalization hit in the 1990s, India's growth rate immediately accelerated to nearly 4% annually. This simultaneous economic catch-up of billions of people contradicted the mid-century belief that poor countries could not get rich by competing globally. The primary finding from 50 years of macroeconomic data is clear. Delinking from the global economy is a dead end for developing nations. Abandoning import substitution for export-led growth provided hundreds of millions of people with a path to higher living standards in a single generation. However, this graphic shows that trade liberalization is not an automatic or flawless solution. If we focus on the data from Latin America, we see that these nations actually experienced slower growth after liberalizing trade than they did during the protective era. There is also a secondary consequence. Trade openness in these regions has been associated with declining real wages and rising inequality for blue-collar workers. Opening borders does not guarantee a sudden catch-up to advanced economies, but the data suggests that nations cannot reach advanced economic status by hiding from the global marketplace.